The guitar strings hummed through the third verse of Folsom Prison Blues when the door at the back of the club opened. Johnny Cash didn't notice. He was locked into the song, eyes half closed, fingers moving across the frets like they'd done 1,000 times before. But the audience noticed. One person turned, then another, then a whole row. Within 10 seconds, half the room had stopped watching Johnny Cash and started watching the door. The club was small, maybe 100 people packed into a space meant for 70. The walls were brick, painted dark red years ago and never touched since. A single spotlight hung above the makeshift stage, throwing harsh shadows across Cash's face. The air smelled like cigarettes and old wood and something else. History, maybe, or just survival. This wasn't the Grand Ole Opry. This wasn't a theater with velvet seats and a sound system built for radio broadcast. This was a Harlem basement club where musicians came after their official gigs were done, where real playing happened after midnight, where you earned respect or you left. Cash's friend Marcus had brought him here. Marcus played upright bass for a jazz quartet that recorded on Blue Note, and he'd been telling Cash for months that if he really wanted to understand American music, he needed to stop performing it and start living in it. "You sing about prisoners," Marcus had said over drinks 2 weeks earlier, "but you ever sat with men who actually did the time? You sing about pain, but you ever been in a room where everybody's carrying that weight for real?" Cash had bristled at first. He'd been to Folsom. He'd played for inmates who had nothing left to lose. He knew something about darkness. But Marcus had just smiled. "Then come with me next Saturday. See if what you know holds up." So here he was, 11:45 on a Saturday night, standing on a stage that was really just a wooden platform somebody had built in the corner, singing Folsom Prison Blues for an audience that had never requested it. They'd been polite so far, quiet, attentive, but Cash could feel it. They were waiting to see if he was real or if he was just another white musician slumming in Harlem for street credibility. He hit the second chorus. His voice carried the same authority it always did, the same deep resonance that made people stop and listen. But something in the room had changed. He could feel it before he could see it. The whispers started in the back and moved forward like a wave. A woman in a red dress turned completely around in her seat. A man near the bar set down his drink without taking a sip. The bartender stopped pouring. The waitress froze mid-step. Cash opened his eyes. That's when he saw the crowd parting. Not scattered movement, not a few people shifting to see better. This was organized, deliberate. Like somebody had drawn an invisible line down the center of the room and everyone knew they needed to be on one side or the other. Through that line walked a man in his 60s, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the kind of calm that only comes from never having to prove anything. He wore a dark suit, perfectly tailored, a white shirt with no tie, and when he walked, nobody looked away. Cash had never seen Bumpy Johnson before, had never met him, had barely heard the name except in passing from Marcus, who'd mentioned it once in the same way you'd mention weather. Casual, inevitable, just a fact of life. But Cash knew exactly who this was. You didn't survive in the music business without learning how to read a room, and every single person in this basement club was reading the same thing right now. Power, real power, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. Bumpy walked to the back row and sat down. The chair was too small for him. His knees barely fit under the table. But he didn't adjust, didn't settle, just sat there with his hands folded on the table and looked at Johnny Cash. And Cash, still playing, still singing, felt every word in his mouth turn to dust. He made it through the verse on muscle memory alone. His fingers knew the chords, his voice knew the melody, but his mind was somewhere else entirely, trying to figure out what it meant that Bumpy Johnson had just walked into his performance and nobody had moved, nobody had breathed, nobody had done anything except wait. The song ended. Cash's hand stilled on the guitar. The room stayed silent. No applause, no reaction, just waiting. Marcus was standing in the wings, his face unreadable. The spotlight buzzed overhead. Someone coughed. The sound felt like breaking glass. Cash looked out at the audience. Then he looked at Bumpy Johnson. And Bumpy looked back. 5 seconds passed, then 10. The silence stretched so long it started to hurt. People shifted in their seats. The bartender reached for a glass and then thought better of it. Then Bumpy stood up. He didn't say anything, didn't gesture, just stood and started walking toward the stage. The crowd parted again, same invisible line, same perfect coordination, like they'd practiced this 1,000 times. Cash watched him come. Every instinct told him to step back, to say something, to fill the silence with words that might explain what was happening. But something else, something deeper, told him to stay exactly where he was. Bumpy climbed the 3 wooden steps to the platform. Each step creaked under his weight. He moved slowly, not threatening, just inevitable. And when he reached the platform, he stood next to Johnny Cash and waited. The spotlight hit them both now. 2 men on a stage built for one. Cash still holding his guitar, Bumpy hands at his sides, neither of them speaking. The room held its breath. Finally, Bumpy spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the club like he'd been using a microphone. They told me a white man was singing our pain. He paused, looked at Cash, then looked out at the crowd. I came to see if you mean it. Every eye in the room was on Johnny Cash now. This was the moment. This was where he either proved Marcus right or proved that he was just another performer playing at something he didn't understand. Cash could have said a lot of things, could have defended himself, could have talked about Folsom, could have mentioned the prisoners he'd met, the stories he'd heard, the darkness he'd seen. Instead, he said 2 words, "Then teach me." The room exhaled. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't loud, just a collective release of tension that had been building since Bumpy walked through the door. A few people nodded. One older man in the corner smiled for the first time all night. Marcus, still standing in the wings, closed his eyes and shook his head like he'd just watched something he'd been hoping to see for a long time. Bumpy studied Cash for another moment. Then he nodded, once, sharp, final. Put down the guitar. Cash did. Bumpy gestured to the audience. What do you see? Cash looked out at the crowd. People. Wrong. Bumpy's voice was patient, like he was teaching something simple that most people got wrong. Look again. What do you see? Cash looked harder this time. He saw the woman in the red dress, her eyes tired but alert. The older man in the corner with his arms crossed. The bartender watching from the back. The waitress still frozen mid-step. The couples at the small tables. The solo drinkers at the bar. I see, Cash started, then stopped. He was about to say the same thing again. People. But that wasn't what Bumpy was asking. You see survival, Bumpy said. Every person in this room has a story about how they're still standing, how they made it through something that should have killed them, how they learned to carry weight nobody should have to carry. That woman in red lost 3 sons, one to the war, one to the streets, one to something nobody talks about. Man in the corner spent 12 years inside for something he didn't do. Bartender survived things your prison songs don't touch. Bumpy stepped closer to the edge of the stage, not threatening, just closing the distance. You sing about prisoners, about pain, about being locked up, but you sing it like it's a story, like it's something that happened to someone else. In here, it's not a story, it's Tuesday. Cash felt something shift in his chest. He'd been singing these songs for years, had believed every word, had meant every note. But Bumpy was right. He'd been singing about pain from the outside, looking in through a window and describing what he saw. So teach me, Cash said again. How do I sing it right? Bumpy looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned to the audience. He wants to learn, Bumpy said. Not a question, just a statement. The room murmured. A few people nodded. The woman in red raised her glass slightly. The old man in the corner uncrossed his arms. Bumpy turned back to Cash. Then stop performing. Stop trying to give them something. Just stand here and listen. He gestured to the crowd. They'll teach you. For the next hour, Johnny Cash didn't sing a single note. He stood on that stage next to Bumpy Johnson and listened. The woman in red told a story about her middle son, the one who didn't come home from Vietnam, how she'd gotten the letter and read it in the kitchen and then made dinner because what else was she supposed to do? The old man in the corner talked about his 12 years inside, not the crime, not the trial, just the small things, how you learn to sleep with one eye open, how you memorize guard shift changes, how you count days not in numbers but in seasons, how winter means one thing on the outside and something completely different on the inside. A young man at the bar, couldn't have been more than 25, talked about his father, how he'd worked 3 jobs to keep the family fed, how he died at 52, how the death certificate said heart attack, but everybody knew it was exhaustion, how survival sometimes just means dying slower. Johnny Cash listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't comment, didn't try to shape what he was hearing into something he could use later. He just listened. And slowly, the room changed. People started looking at him differently, not like a performer, not like an outsider, not even like a student, just like another person in the room who was trying to understand something bigger than himself. Bumpy stood next to him the entire time, silent, watchful, occasionally nodding when someone shared something particularly raw. And when the story slowed down, when the room had given what it needed to give, Bumpy turned to Cash. Now you know the difference. Between what? Cash asked. Between singing about pain and earning the right to. Cash nodded slowly. He understood, or at least he was starting to. Bumpy stepped down from the stage. The crowd parted again. He walked back to his seat in the rear, sat down, and folded his hands on the table. Then he looked at Cash and waited. Cash picked up his guitar. He didn't announce what he was going to play, didn't explain himself, just started playing. Same song, Folsom Prison Blues, but everything about it was different now. He sang it slower, quieter. He took out the performance, the bravado, the showmanship. He sang it like he was telling someone else's story, not his own, like he was honoring something instead of claiming it. The room listened, really listened, and when Cash finished, when the last note faded into silence, the applause came. Not loud, not enthusiastic, just steady, respectful. The kind of applause that says, "We see you now." Cash played 3 more songs that night. Bumpy stayed for all of them. And when Cash finally set down his guitar, when he stepped off the stage and made his way toward the exit, Bumpy was waiting by the door. They didn't shake hands, didn't exchange numbers, didn't make plans to meet again. Bumpy just nodded once. Cash nodded back, and that was it. But it wasn't really it, because something had changed in Johnny Cash that night, something fundamental. He'd walked into that club thinking he understood darkness. He'd walked out knowing he'd barely scratched the surface. Years later, a journalist asked Johnny Cash about his time in Harlem, about the stories people told, about the night Bumpy Johnson supposedly walked into one of his shows and everything changed. Cash thought about it for a long time, long enough for the journalist to start to think he wouldn't answer. Then Cash said, "I learned the difference between singing about pain and earning the right to." The journalist pressed, "What does that mean?" Cash smiled, the kind of smile that says there's more to the story, but some things don't translate into words. "It means I spent most of my career singing about things I'd observed,
That night, I learned to shut up and listen first, because the people living it don't need someone to sing their story for them. They need someone to honor it. There's a difference. The journalist asked, "Did you stay in touch with him, with Bumpy Johnson?" Cash shook his head. "Didn't need to. He taught me what I needed to know in one night, and I've been applying it ever since." The interview ended there. The journalist published the story, but that particular quote never made it into the final article. Editors thought it was too vague, too philosophical, not concrete enough. But people who knew Johnny Cash, really knew him, they understood. They saw the shift in his music after that night, the way he started stripping songs down, the way he stopped performing pain and started honoring it, the way he made space in his music for silence, for weight, for things that couldn't be explained, only felt.
Bumpy Johnson died in 1968. Johnny Cash didn't attend the funeral, wasn't invited, wouldn't have been appropriate anyway. But those who were there later said something strange happened. After the service, a young black man approached Bumpy's family and handed them a guitar pick. Said a white musician had asked him to deliver it. No note, no explanation, just a single guitar pick. Nobody knew what it meant. The family kept it anyway. And years later, when someone asked Bumpy's daughter about it, she smiled. "My father collected debts," she said. "Not money debts, respect debts. When someone learned something from him, that was a debt. Most people never paid it, but this one did." She held up the guitar pick. It was worn, used, the kind of thing a musician carries for years because it fits their hand perfectly. "He paid it by actually learning," she said. "That's all my father ever wanted, for people to actually learn." If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to understand the difference between performing empathy and practicing it. Subscribe for more untold stories about moments that changed music history. And remember, the most powerful lessons come from knowing when to stop talking and start listening.